The blue light of my monitor is the only thing keeping the Chicago skyline from swallowing this office whole. At 2 in the morning, the silence is a physical weight, broken only by a single, sharp notification ping. I stared at the sender's name until the letters blurred into a ghost I thought I buried. They kicked me out at 18 with nothing. 5 years later, I own the company my dad works for, and he just sent me an email. I whispered the words to the empty glass. James Miller had no idea he was writing to his own blood. To him, I was just T.J. Sterling, the faceless venture capitalist who recently liquidated his failing logistics firm. I clicked the message, expecting a resume or a standard corporate plea for retention. Instead, I found a weaponized tragedy designed to harvest unearned pity. He claimed his youngest daughter was a thief and an addict who broke his heart. He used my name to justify his own professional stagnation and mounting personal debts. My pulse remained flat, a steady hum of cold efficiency. In this high-rise sanctuary, panic is just a waste of overhead. I leaned back into the expensive leather, feeling the ghost of a different chair. 5 years ago, the air smelled of stale beer and lemon pledge in a kitchen in Ohio. My 18th birthday card was a black trash bag and 12 crumpled dollars. My father didn't look angry when he ended our contract. He just looked bored. Like he was finally discarding a depreciating asset. I remembered my mother scrubbing a pot that was already spotless. She never looked up while I packed my entire life into that plastic bag. She washed her hands of me in the sink while my sister measured my bedroom for a ring light. That door click was the sound of a lease expiring. Now, I looked at my father's desperate digital signature. He was banking on the empathy of a woman he didn't know. He had built his social standing on the grave of my reputation. I didn't reply with rage. I summoned my CFO at 4 in the morning to pull the private expense reports for the Midwest region. By dawn, the data confirmed my suspicions. James wasn't just a liar. He was a thief on my payroll. He had been inflating mileage and using a shell company to subsidize a life he couldn't afford. I printed the audit, the paper feeling heavy with a specific toxicity. I scheduled a mandatory Zoom review for 9 o'clock. He thought he was fighting for a salary. The notification popped up exactly on time. I kept my camera off, letting him sweat into the void for 2 minutes. He adjusted his tie, his face sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights of that old kitchen table. He began his rehearsed speech about loyalty and the burdens of a troubled home. I let him finish before I shared my screen. The neon yellow highlights of his fraud filled his view. I clicked my camera on. The girl with the trash bag was gone. "Hello, Dad." A James froze as my face filled his monitor. The color drained from his skin, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray against the oak table. He leaned forward until his breath fogged the lens on his end. Brianna was the name he gasped, but I didn't recognize the sound. It was a wheeze of pure terror. He looked back at the kitchen doorway where my mother stood. He was trapped between 2 ghosts in a house I now owned. I watched him try to compute the distance between the girl he discarded and the woman signing his checks. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the living room. Panic replaced his shock. He forced a grotesque smile that didn't reach his rimmed eyes. He told me he always knew I would make it. He called for Jessica and Victoria to come see the rich boss. I remained a statue. The silence from my end was a sharp, clinical blade. My mother burst into the frame, her hands still damp from the sink. She didn't offer an apology. She didn't ask how I had survived 5 winters in Chicago. Instead, she reached for the camera, as if to touch the pearls around my neck. She spoke of family and the bonds of blood. I looked at the pot on the stove behind her. It was the same one she used to ignore my exit. Their love was a late arrival. "Stop talking," I commanded. My voice was low, but it carried the weight of the Chicago skyline. James flinched as if I had struck him. He began a frantic pitch for a promotion. He suggested he could be my vice president of operations, since we were family now. He mentioned Victoria needed a job as a marketing lead. He spoke as if the embezzlement reports on the screen didn't exist. He truly believed his DNA was a get-out of jail card. "You are fired," I said. I listed the charges of fraud and corporate theft with the rhythm of a funeral march. James stood up so fast his chair toppled over. He shouted about his years of service in the house. I picked up the property file. I explained that his home was collateral on a company loan he had defaulted on years ago. Since he was no longer an employee, the grace period was over. He had 30 days to pack. The screaming began then. My mother pleaded for mercy, while my sister wailed in the background about her studio. James called me a monster, his face a mottled purple. I didn't feel the sting of his words. I only felt the hum of the air conditioning. I asked my mother if she had $12. She blinked through her tears, confused by the number. I told her it was enough for a bus ticket. It worked for me. I ended the call before the first sob finished. The screen went black, returning me to the stillness of the penthouse. I opened my wallet and pulled out a single, worn dollar bill. It was the last remnant of the 12 he gave me 5 years ago. I walked to the shredder and fed the paper into the slot. The machine hummed as it turned my past into confetti. I didn't need the reminder anymore. I was finally free. The silence in my office was heavy after the call ended. I looked at the black screen and felt a strange void. There was no rush of joy, just the quiet hum of the server rack. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my cold espresso. I had won every battle, but the room felt smaller than it did an hour ago. Outside, the Chicago wind rattled the triple pane glass. A new notification appeared on my secondary monitor. I opened the file with a practiced click of my mouse. It was a digital copy of the property deed for the Ohio house. My legal team had already flagged the emergency foreclosure notice for my signature. One digital stroke would put them on the street by the end of the month. I stared at the signature line, my finger hovering over the trackpad. This was the final liquidation of my past. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. The door to my office opened without a knock from my assistant. Susan walked in, her silver hair catching the morning light from the window. She didn't say a word as she poured herself a glass of water. She watched me with those sharp, predatory eyes that saw through corporate veneers. She knew exactly what I had just done in that Zoom meeting. Susan thrived on this kind of blood. She sat down across from my desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Brianna," she said softly. Her voice lacked the warmth of a mother, but held the steel of a partner. I told her the audit was successful and the redundant assets were cleared. She smiled, a thin line of satisfaction that made me feel cold. She asked if I was ready to move on to the next acquisition. I realized then that Susan didn't just want profit. She wanted the machine. I signed the foreclosure document with a quick, decisive motion. The software confirmed the filing with a soft chime of finality. It was done, and the Miller family was officially a liability of the past. I looked back at Susan and saw a reflection of my future self. She was a woman who had cut every tie to reach this height. I wondered if she ever regretted the shredding of her own history. The office felt freezing. "I want the keys to the Ohio property," I told her firmly. Susan raised an eyebrow but didn't question my sudden, personal request. She knew that closure often required a physical presence at the site of the original wound. I needed to see that kitchen one last time before the locks were changed. I needed to know the smell of lemon pledge was gone. She nodded and stood up to leave. The hunt was over today. As she reached the door, she turned back with a final thought. She mentioned that a man had been calling the front desk for an hour. He claimed to have information about the safe that James had mentioned in the email. It matched the brass key I found in the ledger. My breath hitched as I realized James had lied about more than just the theft. There was another secret buried in that house. I grabbed my coat and headed for the elevator. The game changed again. The private jet touched down in Ohio just as the gray slush of winter began to freeze over the runway. I sat in the back of a black SUV, watching the skeletal trees blur past the tinted window. My objective was simple: recover whatever James had hidden in the wall safe before the demolition crew arrived. The driver took the back roads toward my childhood home, avoiding the main street where people might still recognize my face. My pulse remained steady. The SUV pulled up to the curb of the modest split level house that once defined my entire world. It looked smaller than I remembered, the vinyl siding stained with years of neglect and rust. Yellow tape already fluttered across the porch, a silent warning from my legal team to the current occupants. I stepped out into the biting wind, the smell of damp earth hitting me instantly. James was standing on the lawn, clutching a cardboard box of office supplies. "You can't go in there, Brianna," James shouted, his voice cracking against the cold air. He tried to block the walkway, but my security detail stepped forward with practiced, silent intimidation. He retreated instantly, his bravado crumbling like dry leaves under their gaze. I didn't look at his face as I brushed past him toward the front door. The lock clicked open with a key that felt heavy and cold. I stepped inside the foyer, the air tasting of dust. The interior was a graveyard of bad decisions and cheap furniture. I walked straight to the master bedroom, ignoring the frantic whispers of my mother in the hallway. I pulled back the framed print of a generic sunset to reveal the old keypad safe. James had claimed I stole $5,000 from this metal box. My fingers danced over the buttons, entering a code he thought I never knew. The door creaked open with a groan of neglected metal. Inside, there was no cash and no missing nest egg. Instead, I found a stack of life insurance policies and a series of pawn tickets dated weeks before my 18th birthday. James hadn't lost $5,000 to a thief. He had gambled it away at a local casino. He framed me to explain the missing money to my mother and the neighbors. I pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger hidden at the very back. It was a record of every lie. I turned to find my mother standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with a realization she had suppressed for years. She saw the pawn tickets in my hand and the empty safe behind me. The power balance shifted as the light hit the truth. She didn't offer a defense for her husband this time. She just looked at her empty hands, and then at the daughter she had abandoned. I felt a cold surge of pity. It was far too late. She reached out, but I stepped back into the hallway, severing the last thread of hope she held. I walked out of the house without saying another word to either of them. The driver held the door open as I climbed back into the warmth of the SUV. I opened the ledger to the final page and saw a name I didn't expect to find. Susan had been sending James monthly payments for 3 years before the acquisition even started. My mentor hadn't just found me. She had been monitoring the entire collapse. My phone buzzed with a text from her. The SUV sped toward the regional airport while the cabin air turned frigid. I stared at the leather ledger in my lap, tracing the ink of Susan's signatures. Every payment was a breadcrumb leading back to my own front door. She hadn't stumbled upon my code in a public library by accident. She had been funding the very poverty that fueled my obsession with logistics. My mentor was the architect of my misery. I looked at the glass partition separating me from the driver. The world felt like a staged play. My objective shifted from mere revenge to total corporate insulation. I needed to scrub Susan's influence from Vortex Chain before she activated whatever trap she had set. My phone buzzed again with her name, flashing across the screen. I ignored it, focused instead on the local bank, branch visible through the window. James had hidden more than just pawn tickets. The ledger mentioned a safe deposit box registered under a name I hadn't used in years. Brianna Miller was still alive in the paperwork of a dying steel town. The bank smelled of old carpet and wet wool. I walked past the teller with the cold authority of a woman who bought entire cities. The manager greeted me with a nervous sweat on his brow. He led me down to the vault, the heavy door groaning as it swung open on greased hinges. I clutched the key I found in the leather ledger. My obstacle was the legal clock. Susan would notice my detour within minutes. I had to secure the contents before her legal team froze my access. Inside the small metal box lay a single flash drive and a handwritten note from my father. The paper was yellowed and brittle, dated the night he threw me out. He didn't write an apology for the $12 or the trash bag. He wrote a warning about Susan. He had been her original logistics manager before the gambling took hold of his life. He was the one who taught her how to hide assets in the supply chain. He had been her silent partner in a massive tax evasion scheme. The power balance shattered as I realized James wasn't just a failure. He was a witness. He had leveraged my career to keep Susan from testifying against him for his own petty thefts. He had sold me into corporate servitude to cover his tracks. I plugged the drive into my encrypted tablet, watching the files populate the screen. It was a roadmap of shell companies and illegal offshore accounts. Susan wasn't just my mentor. She was the primary target of a federal investigation that I now led. A shadow fell over the vault table. I looked up to see the bank manager standing there with two men in dark suits. They weren't bank security. They had the sharp, hungry look of Susan's private enforcers. The pressure spiked as they blocked the only exit from the small room. They didn't draw weapons. But their presence was a physical threat. One of them held out a phone. Susan's face appeared on the screen, her smile as thin as a razor blade. She knew I had found the box. "You were always too smart for your own good, Brianna?" Susan said. Her voice was distorted by the speaker, but the steel remained. She told me to hand over the drive, and we could go back to the office. She promised me a seat on the board of the new conglomerate. I looked at the enforcers and then at the encrypted files. I had exactly 3 seconds to make an irreversible decision. I clicked the button to broadcast the data to the federal tip line. The room went silent. The enforcers moved forward, but a secondary alarm suddenly blared through the vault. The local police had arrived, triggered by the silent panic button I pressed under the table. The suits retreated toward the back exit, realizing the scene had gone public. I stood up, clutching the drive like a holy relic. My father's ledger sat abandoned on the cold metal table. I had saved myself, but the cost was the total destruction of the company I built. Vortex. Chain would not survive the coming legal firestorm. I walked out of the bank into the blinding Ohio snow. The police cruisers formed a ring of flashing red and blue around the SUV. James had slipped away from the bank in the chaos, his destination unknown. I looked at the digital confirmation on my tablet. The data was in the hands of the authorities. I had won, but I was standing in the cold with nothing but a flash drive. My phone pinged one final time. It was a message from an unknown number. My father was waiting. The slush beneath my boots felt like a physical anchor as I navigated the bank parking lot. My objective was a rusted sedan idling near the edge of the property. James sat behind the wheel, his face illuminated by the dim orange glow of the dashboard. He didn't look like a regional manager or a villain anymore. He looked like a man who had run out of lies to tell. I opened the passenger door and sat down, the scent of cheap tobacco filling my lungs. James handed me a heavy envelope without making eye contact. He told me the ledger was only the surface of Susan's corruption. The primary obstacle was a physical hard drive hidden in the warehouse he had managed for a decade. Susan's enforcers were likely already tearing the house apart looking for it. We had to reach the facility before her team sanitized the evidence of the offshore shell companies. The engine groaned as he shifted into gear. We pulled out into the blinding white snow of the evening. The drive was silent until we reached the industrial district. Warehouses stood like giant gray tombstones against the winter sky. James used his old security badge to bypass the main gate, a small victory in a losing war. We climbed the stairs to his former office, the air thick with the smell of diesel and cold metal. He pointed toward a loose floorboard beneath the heavy oak desk. I knelt down, my fingers cold and clumsy as I pried the wood away from the subfloor. I found the drive, but the power suddenly cut to the building. The emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the vast warehouse floor. We were trapped in a cage of steel and high, fenced logistics. I heard the distant heavy slam of a bay door downstairs. Susan had anticipated our move. She wasn't sending lawyers this time. She was sending the men from the bank vault. The pressure in the room became a physical weight against my chest and lungs. We retreated toward the catwalks, the metal grating humming under our feet. I looked down and saw 3 figures, moving with professional precision through the rows of shipping containers. One of them held a tablet, likely tracking the GPS signal from my own phone. I realized then that I was the beacon leading them straight to my father. I turned the device off and dropped it into a vat of engine coolant. The hunters paused, their target suddenly vanishing from the digital map. We moved in silence. The mid-scene turn came when James stopped at a junction. He revealed that he hadn't just been Susan's partner. He had been recording her private meetings for years as a form of insurance. He reached into his coat and pulled out a digital recorder. He had evidence that she had authorized the acquisition of heritage holers, specifically to frame me for the impending collapse. I wasn't the victor of a corporate raid. I was the designated fall girl for a massive bankruptcy. The realization was a freezing wave of clarity. I took the recorder, feeling the balance of power shift in the dark. I didn't need the company to survive. I only needed to ensure Susan went down with the ship she had built. We reached the fire exit, the biting cold air rushing in to meet us. James told me to go while he diverted the men toward the loading docks. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for a way to stop running. I hesitated, then nodded. He disappeared back into the shadows. I ran toward the perimeter fence, the snow stinging my eyes. A black car waited on the other side, but it wasn't my security detail. Susan stepped out of the back seat, her face a mask of calm calculation. She held a gun, but she didn't point it at me. She pointed it toward the warehouse where James was hiding. She told me to hand over the drive, or she would signal her men to fire. The wind howled between us, carrying the sound of a struggle. I looked at the drive in my hand, and then at the dark silhouette of the warehouse. Susan offered me a deal to walk away with my reputation intact. I realized that my survival had always been a series of transactions. If I gave her the drive, James would die and I would remain a CEO. If I kept it, the truth would come out, but I would be a nobody again. I felt the familiar weight of the $12 in my memory. I chose. I threw the drive into the dark, frozen creek that ran alongside the property. Susan screamed and fired a shot into the air, but I was already moving. The hard drive disappeared beneath the ice, lost to the currents of the Ohio winter. I knew the authorities already had the digital broadcast I sent from the vault. This physical copy was just a heavy ghost I no longer needed to carry. I had already dismantled her world by refusing to play her game. But as I reached the road, I saw a new notification on my secondary tablet. James was pinned inside by Susan's men. The sirens cut through the winter air, signaling the end of Susan's reign. She stared at the frozen creek where the drive vanished, her face twisted in a mask of pure fury. I stood my ground, the cold biting through my coat as her enforcers retreated into the shadows. They knew the authorities were too close now. The game of high-stakes corporate chess was over. I had sacrificed my queen to save the board. Susan was finally powerless and alone. I walked toward the warehouse entrance, ignoring the shouts of the arriving police officers. My heart hammered against my ribs as I searched for the man who had stayed behind. I found James slumped against a stack of shipping pallets near the loading dock. He was breathing heavily, his hand pressed against a dark stain on his shoulder. He looked at me and tried to smile, but it was just a pained grimace. He handed me a small, brass key. "That opens the safe in the basement," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. I didn't ask what was inside. I simply squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses of a life spent in transit. He had spent years running from his mistakes, but he had stopped for me. The medical team pushed past, taking him into the light of the ambulances. I stood in the dark, the brass key warming in my palm. I knew the safe held the final proof of my mother's innocence in Susan's scheme. My past was finally quiet. I drove back to the city, while the sun began to peek over the horizon. The news was already breaking about the collapse of Vortex, Chain, and Susan's arrest. My name was everywhere, but I felt like a stranger to the woman on the screen. I had lost the company, the penthouse, and the cold prestige. I arrived at the Greyhound station and watched the buses depart. I realized that my success was never about the money or the glass towers. I sat on a wooden bench, watching a young woman struggle with a heavy plastic bag. She looked exactly like I did 5 years ago, lost in a world of predators. I reached into my pocket and found the last $12 I had kept. I walked over and placed the bills in her hand. She looked at me with confusion and a spark of hope. I told her to buy a ticket and never look back. I was human again. I walked toward the library, the only place where I ever truly felt safe. The logic of the world had returned to its proper state. I had no empire to run, but I had a clean slate and a sharp mind. I pulled out my laptop and opened a fresh terminal window. The cursor blinked, waiting for my next move. I began to write a new algorithm, but this time, it wasn't for profit. My father's name appeared on my phone.